You get so in tune with things about time. That's the thing I absolutely hated about working for a CPA firm, because you've got a time sheet and you've got to account from your time in your office from the time you walk in the door until the time you leave the firm building. And I'm talking about hour by hour, minute by minute. Now it depends on the firm. Some firms break it down into a quarter of an hour. Our firm broke it down into eighths of an hour. Try that on for some time. It gets pretty aggravating. I just couldn't stand that. But our lives are revolved around measurement. You know, there was a man, I heard this story the other day. There was a man who set his watch by a jewelry store clock. He'd walk by this jewelry store and he'd take his watch off and he'd set it for the clock. And he kept walking by, and then he'd walk to the plant where he worked. And the jeweler stopped him one day and said, "Hey, how come you're setting your watch by my clock every day?" He said, "Well, one of my jobs over there at the plant is to blow the whistle at 5 o'clock when the day's done." He said, "Well, you can't be doing that." And the guy said, "Why?" And the jeweler says, "Because I set my clock by your whistle that blows at 5 o'clock. But our lives revolve around these things. Let's look at measurements. "And this is the fashion which thou shalt make of it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. You think if he'd have built it differently, it would have worked? Don't think so. It had a total floor space. I looked up some facts about this, because when I looked at this verse, I said, well, let me see what the internet's got to say about this. It had a total floor space of 96,000 square feet. I don't know how many of you know about buildings. It's a rarity to find a building with 96,000 square feet. The ark's length was 6 times its width and 10 times its height. Many modern ships have similar proportions. I used to work in Pascagoula, Mississippi. I don't know if you know where Pascagoula is, but Pascagoula, the biggest industry in Pascagoula is Ingalls Shipbuilding. You grew up in Mobile, so you know exactly where.
Daddy retired there.
Really? Okay. Of course, Ingalls contributed a lot to the city of Pascagoula. The mayor, when I worked for the city of Pascagoula, he used to call Pascagoula the Wall Street of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Anyway, here's an artist's conception, if you can see this. That's a football field. All of us in here know about football fields because we're football fans of one sort or another. If you put it down on a football field, it would be bigger than the football field. So what is measurement then? What is this measurement? It's a standard. In religion, our standard is the Word of God. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. God's detail is precise in measurement. In the 25th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was smitten. Talk about nailing it down. Look at the information. The 5th and 20th year, the beginning of the year, the 10th day of the month, 14th. I mean, he gives you information. You can't fail to figure that out. And the self same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me thither. Now, if you read this chapter, the whole chapter is talking about measurements. As a matter of fact, you read chapter 41, chapter 42, It just goes on and on and on about. I was going to pull that up on the screen, but we don't have time for that. He just goes on and on with this measuring. Is that unimportant? Well, if he goes on for 3 chapters, it can't be unimportant. It can't be insignificant. You know what's interesting about this? And there was 2 or 3 authorities that I looked at that said this same thing. The Jews forbid the reading of this passage and this chapter until a man has arrived at 30 years of age. And then he must expect to meet with things in it if he does not understand it, and which must be left until Elijah comes to explain them. Now, Matthew Henry quoted that. John Gill quoted that. I found 3 or 4 others. Everyone, I'd never seen that before. Here's an artist's conception. He's talking about measurements in this chapter, and some say that it was a measurement of the temple. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But this professor that built this, the visionary Ezekiel temple plan drawn by the 19th century French architect and Bible scholar, I can't pronounce that last name, Charles Chipez, I suppose. But he says that's what he was talking about there. I don't know. The gateways of Ezekiel's temple is described in the book of Ezekiel, drawn by the French architect. He went to great pains. Now, why did he go to great pains? Because if you look at these chapters, it gives you all these dimensions. Any of you take drafting in high school like I did? Well, if you took drafting in high school, this reminds you of some of the things you did when you took drafting. It had to be very precise. However, I don't think that's the case. I don't think he was talking about the temple. This is going to be sort of out there. So try this on for size. In the visions of God brought to me in the land of Israel, and set me upon a very high mountain, by which was the frame of a city on the south. Isaiah 40 and verse 2. Now immediately it would come to your mind, well, this got to be talking about Jerusalem. Well, I didn't have room to put this out there, but I normally say, try this on for size. I just didn't have room to put the phrase in there. I wonder if this is a prophecy of Satan taking Jesus up upon a high mountain, showing him the kingdoms of the world. Haggai 2 and verse 6 speaks of the destruction of the sea and the dry land. I wonder if the sea is the Jews and the dry land the Gentiles or nations, whatever you choose to call them. And Ezekiel is prophesying about the destruction of the Jerusalem and the Gentile inhabitants. I wrote Professor Hopkins and said, what do you think? I said, here's some of my musings on it. You know what Professor Hopkins said? He said, sounds like some of my musings too. Well, that makes 2 of us, so we may both be wrong. I don't know. What's the purpose of measurements then? What are you talking about, Lloyd? And there was given to me a reed like unto a rod. And the angel stood, saying, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and to them that worship therein. I got something to say, so hang on. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city they shall tread underfoot 40 and 2 months. Now, without getting into a lot of discussion, there's a lot of discussion about that 40 and 2 months. There's a lot of discussion about leaving the court out. There's a lot of discussion about the rod and the length of it and all of that sort of thing, and I won't get into that. David, you look like you want to say something. Okay.
It's not the time.
Okay. I've had two questions, and I've never seen anybody else. That doesn't surprise you because Lloyd falls off the deep end occasionally. I've had two questions that I've never seen anybody else. I've read Brother Wallace's commentary. He doesn't ask either one of these questions. What was the purpose of the measurements? Have you ever thought about that? And he carried me away into the Spirit to a great and high mountain. Does that sound familiar, what I just said? And he showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. A lot of information there. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city, and the gates thereof, and the wall thereof. Did you catch the contrast there? He measured the temple with a rod, but he measured the city that came down from heaven with a golden reed. You think that's not important? I think it is. And the city lieth foursquare, and the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. The length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. Now, let me give you my thoughts. The measuring instrument in Revelation 11 was the law. The measuring instrument in Revelation, and I left a V off, 21 was the law of Christ, or the New Testament. So what's the point? Well, let me ask you another question. Why was it necessary to do the measurement in the first place? Remember I asked, there was two questions that I asked. I've never seen anybody ask either one of those questions. What was the purpose of the measurement? I'll let you answer that. I have my own thoughts about it. It was to determine which one was perfect. And the second had to be measured with a perfect instrument in order to determine whether or not it was perfect. You know, somewhere, I think it's over in Zurich, some of you may know that have traveled afar, there is a platinum iridium bar that has a scratch on either end, and that is the meter measurement. That is the measurement of 1 meter. Every meter stick has got to be exactly that length, or it's not a meter. Well, what's the purpose? There's a point about this. If the structure, the spiritual structure that is, does not measure up, as it were, it is not the true structure. The level of one's maturity does not change what is truth. Even an immature Christian can state, as I have done from an early age of my Christianity, that he or she believes in the entirety of the scriptures that contain truth, even though he or she may not comprehend all of it. In fact, I'm still learning, as all of us, I hope. And depending on one's point of view, I could be considered somewhat immature, and yet I've stated that. David and I had a discussion about this week. We may even be considered immature by some, and yet have just stated that the Bible is true. Just because one does not know or comprehend all truth, which I may submit to you that none of us do, does not mean we cannot understand what is truth. Jesus said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Does that mean we must understand the entirety of the scripture in order to be saved? Or does it mean that we shall know where truth is contained? I would submit that it's the latter. If we have no standard, we have no standard means of measurement. If we didn't have a standard for the meter over in Zurich, how would we know what a meter is? Even the new temple was measured with the perfect standard, the golden measuring rod. Well, I'll leave it with you to ponder that yourself, and that's the lesson for today. Today, as a child of God, if there's something amiss in your life or something for which you need the prayers of the church, He's always provided a way back for us. And He says in James chapter 5 and verse 16, confess your faults one to another and pray one for another that you might be healed. If you feel you need to respond, do so now as we sing the invitation song.